In 20,000 years, humanity will not just live in space. We will be part of it. If you enjoy mind-bending journeys through the cosmos, hit that like button and subscribe to join our exploration of the universe. Picture this. A child opens their eyes for the first time, but this child will never feel rain on their skin. They will never know the weight of standing on solid ground. They will never see a sunset paint the horizon in shades of orange and pink, because this child was born inside a massive cylinder spinning through the darkness between stars. To them, the curve of their world is normal. The hum of life support is as familiar as birdsong once was to us. And the word Earth is just a story their grandparents told them, a myth from a time before anyone alive can remember. 20,000 years is a span of time that the human mind struggles to comprehend. It is longer than all of recorded human history. When our ancestors were painting caves and hunting mammoths with stone spears, they were not thinking about the stars. They were thinking about survival. And now we stand at a threshold where survival itself might demand that we leave this pale blue dot behind. What happens to a species when it abandons the only world it has ever known and ventures into the void for 200 centuries? This is not a question of science fiction. It is a question that scientists, biologists, and philosophers are seriously asking, because the pressures of space are unlike anything life on Earth has ever faced. And evolution does not care about our preferences. It does not ask permission. It simply happens. Change follows pressure. Adaptation follows challenge. And 20,000 years of cosmic pressure would change us in ways we can barely imagine. Think about how much humanity has changed in just the last 10,000 years. We went from scattered tribes to global civilizations. We developed writing, agriculture, cities, and technology that our ancestors would call magic. Now imagine twice that span of time. But instead of adapting to different climates on one planet, humans would be adapting to environments that break every rule our bodies evolved to follow. The first thing we need to understand is that space is fundamentally hostile to everything we are. Our bodies are masterpieces of biological engineering, but they are masterpieces designed for one very specific environment, Earth. Every system in your body, from the fluid in your eyes to the calcium in your bones, evolved under the constant pull of gravity. Remove that gravity, and the body starts to fall apart in slow motion. We already see this in astronauts who spend just a few months on the International Space Station. Their bones begin to lose density at a rate 10 times faster than the most severe cases of osteoporosis on Earth. Their muscles waste away despite hours of daily exercise. The fluid in their bodies shifts upward, away from their legs and into their heads. Their faces puff up. The pressure in their skulls increases. Some astronauts report changes in their vision that take years to correct after returning home. And these are just the effects we see after months. What happens after years, after decades, after generations? The answer lies in one of the most powerful forces in nature, evolution. But not the slow, gradual evolution we typically imagine. Research published in recent years suggests that evolution in space could happen between 1,000 and 10,000 times faster than it does on Earth. The reason is twofold. First, the cosmic radiation that bathes everything beyond the protection of our atmosphere dramatically increases mutation rates in DNA. Second, the extreme pressures of the space environment create what scientists call strong selective pressure. Traits that help survival in space would spread through populations rapidly. Traits that hinder survival would be ruthlessly eliminated. Let that sink in for a moment. Evolution happening 10,000 times faster than normal. In 20,000 years under those conditions, the descendants of current humans could undergo changes that would normally take millions of years on Earth. But what would those changes actually look like? To answer that question, we need to think about the specific challenges that space presents, and there are many. Microgravity, cosmic radiation, limited resources, confined spaces, isolation from Earth. Each of these pressures would push human evolution in different directions. And the populations that survive would be the ones whose bodies and minds adapted most successfully. Let us start with the most obvious challenge, the absence of gravity that we call microgravity. On Earth, gravity is the invisible sculptor that shaped every living thing. Plants grow upward because of gravity. Our bones are dense because they need to support our weight against gravity. Our hearts are positioned to pump blood upward to our brains against gravity. Take away this constant force, and the body must reinvent itself. In zero-gravity environments, the human skeleton becomes a liability. We carry around approximately 15 pounds of bone mass that exists primarily to resist gravitational compression. In space, those dense bones are not just unnecessary. They are actively harmful. The body recognizes that it is expending precious resources to maintain structures it does not need, and so it begins to dissolve them. Calcium leaches out of bones and into the bloodstream. The skeleton becomes lighter, more fragile by Earth standards, but perhaps better suited for a weightless world. Over thousands of years, evolution would favor humans whose bodies are naturally more efficient at retaining bone minerals in low gravity. The genes that code for rapid bone loss would be selected against. Meanwhile, genes that help maintain skeletal integrity with less mechanical stress would become more common in the population. The result might be humans with bones that are less dense but more flexible. Skeletons optimized for floating rather than standing. But the changes to the skeleton would go far beyond simple bone density. The entire shape of the human body evolved for upright walking on a flat surface. Our thick leg bones, our arched feet, our curved spine. All of these features are adaptations for bipedal locomotion under gravity. In a zero-gravity environment, none of them serve any purpose. Scientists speculate that after many generations in space, humans might develop what could be called prehensile feet. Imagine feet that function more like hands, with toes that can grip and manipulate objects. In a three-dimensional environment, where every surface is potentially a floor, a ceiling, or a wall, the ability to grab onto things with all four limbs would be tremendously advantageous. Natural selection could favor a return to something like the grasping feet of our primate ancestors, but adapted for the corridors of spacecraft rather than the branches of trees. Picture a human with 4 functional hands, navigating their cylindrical world by grabbing handholds and pushing off surfaces in any direction. Their movements would seem alien to us, graceful in ways we could never achieve with our gravity-bound bodies. They would dance through 3-dimensional spaces that would make Earth humans dizzy with disorientation. The changes would extend to muscles as well. The powerful muscles of our legs and backs that constantly work against gravity would wither without their evolutionary purpose. But the muscles used for fine motor control, for gripping and pulling and precise manipulation, these would be preserved or even enhanced. The result might be humans with slender limbs, but remarkably dexterous hands. Beings who struggle to walk, but who can perform feats of manual precision that would astonish us. Now consider what happens to the cardiovascular system. Your heart pumps blood throughout your body against the constant resistance of gravity. When you stand up too quickly, You sometimes feel lightheaded because gravity pulls blood away from your brain and your heart needs a moment to compensate. In zero gravity, this entire system needs to be reconfigured. Astronauts experience this as a fluid shift. Without gravity pulling blood downward, it accumulates in the upper body. The heart, sensing what it interprets as excess fluid, begins reducing blood volume. The legs shrink while the head swells. Over short time periods, this is merely uncomfortable. Over generations, it could reshape the entire human form. Some scientists predict that space-adapted humans might have larger heads and smaller bodies. Not because of some science fiction cliché, but because the cardiovascular dynamics of zero gravity favor this configuration. A heart that does not need to pump blood against gravity can be smaller and weaker by Earth standards, while still being perfectly functional for space. The result might be beings with proportions that look strange to us, but that are perfectly optimized for their environment. But the cardiovascular system is just one of many bodily systems that would face radical restructuring. Consider the digestive system. On Earth, gravity helps move food through our digestive tract. The downward pull assists peristalsis, the muscular contractions that push food from mouth to stomach to intestines. In space, this assistance disappears. Astronauts on the International Space Station already report digestive discomfort, bloating, reflux, irregular bowel movements. These problems are manageable for short missions, but for permanent space populations, the digestive system would need to evolve. Over generations, the muscles of the digestive tract might become stronger and more coordinated. The shape and position of organs might shift to better function without gravitational assistance. The gut microbiome, that vast ecosystem of bacteria that helps us digest food, might evolve alongside our bodies, developing new species of microorganisms better suited to the space environment. This is a fascinating possibility that often gets overlooked. When we talk about human evolution in space, we tend to focus on human cells. But we are not alone in our bodies. We carry trillions of microbial passengers. These microorganisms are essential for our survival. They help us digest food. They produce vitamins we cannot make ourselves. They train our immune systems. They may even influence our moods and behavior. In space, this microbial ecosystem faces the same pressures we do. Microgravity, radiation, confinement. And microorganisms evolve much faster than humans. Their generation times are measured in hours rather than decades. In 20,000 human years, the microbial populations inside space-dwelling humans would undergo millions of generations of evolution. What would these evolved microbes be like? They might become more efficient at extracting nutrients from limited food sources. They might develop tolerance for the recycled and processed foods that space habitats would depend on. They might become better at protecting their human hosts from the pathogens that inevitably arise in closed environments. Or they might evolve in directions we cannot predict, developing new relationships with human cells that could be beneficial or harmful. The coevolution of humans and their microbiomes would be a complex dance, each influencing the other, each adapting to changes in the other. The humans of 20,000 years hence would not just be genetically different from us. They would carry entire ecosystems inside them that have been shaped by millennia of cosmic existence. Now consider the senses. Our sensory systems evolved to perceive the world of Earth. Our eyes detect the wavelengths of light that penetrate Earth's atmosphere. Our ears hear the frequencies of sound that travel through Earth's air. Our skin feels the temperatures and pressures of Earth's environment. In space, many of these sensory parameters would be different. Start with vision. The light inside a space habitat would be artificial, created by lamps or reflected from mirrors. The spectrum might be different from natural sunlight. The intensity might vary. The direction might come from unusual angles in a rotating habitat where the light source is on the central axis. Over time, human vision might adapt to these conditions. The color receptors in our eyes might shift to better perceive artificial light spectra. The light sensitivity of our retinas might change to match the illumination levels inside habitats. The spatial processing of our visual cortex might reorganize to interpret the strange visual environment of a curved horizon that rises rather than falls. Some of these changes might be advantageous. Space-adapted eyes might be better at seeing in low-light conditions. They might be less susceptible to damage from the occasional radiation exposure that penetrates habitat shielding. They might process three-dimensional spatial information in ways that our flat horizon-adapted eyes cannot. But other changes might represent losses. The ability to perceive the subtle colors of a sunset might fade when there are no sunsets to see. The capacity to track distant objects against a far horizon might atrophy when the farthest visible point is the opposite wall of a cylinder. The eyes of space-adapted humans might be perfectly functional for their environment, but unable to fully appreciate the visual world we take for granted. Hearing, too, would change. Sound travels differently in enclosed spaces. Echoes and reverberations behave according to the geometry of the environment. The background noise of a space habitat, the constant hum of air circulation and machinery, would provide a very different acoustic environment than the sounds of nature on Earth. Space-adapted humans might become better at filtering out constant background noise. They might develop keener sensitivity to the sounds that matter in their environment, the alarms that signal danger, the voices of companions, the subtle changes in machinery that indicate potential problems. But they might lose the ability to appreciate birdsong or the crash of waves, sounds that would be meaningless in a world where birds have never flown and waves have never broken. Touch and proprioception, the sense of body position, would undergo perhaps the most dramatic changes. In microgravity, the constant pressure of weight on skin disappears. The internal sense of where your limbs are, normally aided by the pull of gravity on muscles and joints, must rely entirely on other signals. The haptic world of a space dweller would be fundamentally different from ours. Scientists have observed that astronauts develop altered proprioception during spaceflight. They become less accurate at sensing the position of their limbs without looking at them. They report strange sensations of disconnection from their bodies. These effects mostly reverse after returning to Earth. But for beings who have never experienced gravity, who have evolved across hundreds of generations in microgravity, the sense of embodiment might be radically different from ours. Imagine a being whose sense of body position is based entirely on joint angles and muscle tensions, without any gravitational reference, who experiences their body as a freely floating collection of parts, rather than a weight-bearing column. Who has proprioceptive intuitions for three-dimensional movement that we cannot even imagine? Such beings might be able to coordinate complex acrobatic movements in zero gravity with ease, but they might feel lost and disoriented the moment they stepped onto a planetary surface. The sense of smell and taste would also evolve, though perhaps more slowly. In a closed environment where every molecule of air is recycled, the olfactory landscape would be very different from Earth. The smells of nature, of plants and rain and soil, would be absent. Instead, the air would carry the chemical signatures of recycled materials, of growing systems, of the concentrated humanity sharing a small space. Space-adapted humans might develop greater sensitivity to the smells that matter in their environment, the ability to detect subtle chemical changes that indicate problems with life support systems, the capacity to identify individuals by their personal scent in a community where everyone knows everyone, but the appreciation for the complex bouquet of a forest or the salt smell of the sea might fade from human sensory experience. Beyond the 5 traditional senses, consider the lesser-known senses that would also face pressure. The vestibular sense of balance would be radically restructured, as we have discussed. Interoception, the sense of internal body states like hunger and fatigue, might change in response to different metabolic demands. The sense of time, which on Earth is tied to the day-night cycle and seasonal variations, would need to be rebuilt around artificial rhythms. The circadian rhythm, our internal 24-hour clock, evolved in response to Earth's rotation. It regulates sleep, hormone levels, body temperature, and countless other physiological processes. In space, where natural daylight does not exist, this system faces disruption. Astronauts on the International Space Station experience 16 sunrises and sunsets every 24 hours as they orbit Earth. Their circadian rhythms become confused. Sleep becomes difficult. Performance suffers. For short missions, artificial lighting schedules can partially compensate. But for permanent space populations, the circadian system itself might need to evolve. Over many generations, humans might develop more flexible circadian rhythms, or they might evolve to match whatever artificial light schedule their habitat provides, or they might lose the connection to a 24-hour cycle entirely, developing internal clocks based on different time periods. The concept of a day might become as foreign to them as the concept of a horizon. Sleep itself might change. On Earth, sleep is characterized by a particular position, usually lying down, and by particular physiological changes, including changes in muscle tone and blood flow that are influenced by gravity. In space, sleep is different. Astronauts sleep while floating, anchored in sleeping bags to prevent drifting. Their bodies do not experience the postural relaxation that gravity-bound sleep provides. Over time, space-adapted sleep might become something we would not recognize. The stages of sleep might be different. The physiological processes that occur during sleep might be reorganized for a weightless body. The dreams that emerge from space-adapted brains processing experiences we cannot imagine might be unlike any dreams that humans have ever dreamed. Speaking of the brain, let us explore in more detail how the central nervous system might evolve over 20,000 years in space. The human brain is remarkably plastic. It can reorganize itself in response to new demands. People who lose their sight develop enhanced hearing. People who lose a limb see their motor cortex repurposed for other functions. Experts in particular skills develop enlarged brain regions associated with those skills. London taxi drivers have larger hippocampi than average, enlarged by the demands of spatial navigation. This plasticity operates within an individual lifetime, but evolution can build on it. Traits that enhance plasticity can be selected for. Brain regions that prove useful can expand across generations, while those that prove useless can shrink. The brain is not fixed. It is a work in progress that evolution continues to revise. In space, many brain functions would face new demands, while others would become obsolete. The neural circuits for walking and balance would have little use, but the circuits for three-dimensional spatial reasoning, for fine motor coordination, for social cognition in small groups, these would be exercised constantly. Over generations, the brain might restructure itself in fundamental ways. The motor areas devoted to bipedal locomotion might shrink or be repurposed. The areas for spatial processing might expand. New connections might form between regions that rarely communicate in earthbound brains. The very architecture of thought might change. What would it be like to think in a brain that has been shaped by 20,000 years of cosmic evolution? We cannot really know. Consciousness is the most private of phenomena. We can observe brains from the outside, measure their activity, note their structures. But we cannot directly experience what it is like to be a differently structured mind. We can speculate that space-adapted minds might process information differently. They might have intuitions that we lack, and lack intuitions that we take for granted. They might find certain problems easy that we find hard, and certain problems hard that we find easy. Their creativity might flow in different directions. Their emotional responses might have different triggers. Their sense of self might be organized around different principles. The question of consciousness is particularly interesting in the context of space adaptation. Philosophers have long debated what consciousness is and why it exists. Some argue that it is an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing. Others argue that it requires specific biological structures. Still others suggest that it might be a fundamental feature of the universe that humans merely tap into. If consciousness emerges from particular patterns of neural activity, then significant changes to brain structure might produce significant changes to the nature of consciousness itself. Space-adapted beings might not just think differently. They might experience existence differently. Their inner lives might have qualities that we cannot imagine because we lack the neural architecture to generate them. This raises profound questions about continuity of identity across evolutionary change. If the consciousness of our descendants is fundamentally different from our own, in what sense are they our descendants at all? Is there a thread of continuous experience connecting us to them? Or would each generation be a new beginning, related to the previous generation only by biological lineage? On Earth, we assume that despite all our differences, all humans share a basically similar form of consciousness. We can communicate, we can empathize, we can understand each other's experiences, at least in broad terms. This assumption allows us to speak of human nature, of shared human values, of universal human rights. But among species that have evolved along different trajectories for 20,000 years, this assumption might not hold. The consciousness of beings adapted to one environment might be as alien to those adapted to another environment as human consciousness is to an octopus or a bee. They might share biological descent, but not psychological kinship. This possibility is both exciting and troubling. Exciting because it suggests that consciousness itself might be far more variable than we imagine, that there might be modes of experiencing existence that we have never glimpsed. Troubling because it suggests that the unity of humanity might not survive the dispersion into space, that the children of Earth might become strangers to each other in the deepest possible way. Let us now turn to another aspect of biological adaptation that deserves attention: the immune system. The human immune system is a marvel of evolutionary engineering. It defends us against countless pathogens, bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites that would otherwise kill us. It distinguishes self from non-self with remarkable precision. It remembers past infections and responds more quickly to repeated exposure. It is, in a sense, a learning system that adapts to the specific threats it encounters. In space, the immune system faces serious challenges. Studies of astronauts show that immune function is suppressed during spaceflight. T cells, the white blood cells that coordinate immune responses, become less effective. Dormant viruses like herpes can reactivate. Even minor infections become more difficult to control. The reasons for this immune dysfunction are not fully understood. Microgravity itself may affect immune cell function. The stress of spaceflight may suppress immunity. Radiation exposure may damage immune cells. The confined environment may alter the microbial challenges the immune system faces. Probably all of these factors contribute. For short missions, these effects are manageable. But for permanent space populations, a weakened immune system would be disastrous. Infections that spread through a small, enclosed community could become epidemics. Without the ability to isolate the infected or to produce unlimited medical supplies, even minor illnesses could threaten the entire population. Evolution would need to solve this problem, and it might do so in several ways. One possibility is that space-adapted immune systems would become more robust, better able to function in microgravity and under radiation stress. The genes that confer immune resilience would be selected for, spreading through the population over generations. Another possibility is that immune systems would become more focused. On Earth, our immune systems must defend against a vast array of potential pathogens. But in a closed space habitat, the microbial environment would be more limited. The immune system might evolve to be highly effective against the specific pathogens present in that environment, while losing some of its broad-spectrum capabilities. This focused immunity could be a double-edged sword. It might provide excellent protection within the habitat, while leaving the population vulnerable to any new pathogens that might be introduced. A disease from Earth or from another habitat could sweep through a population with no immunity, potentially causing extinction. A third possibility involves not just the immune system, but the entire relationship between humans and microbes. In a closed environment where every organism is monitored and controlled, the relationship between host and pathogen might be deliberately managed. Dangerous pathogens might be eliminated. Beneficial microbes might be cultivated. The microbial ecosystem might become as artificial as the habitat itself. Such management would reduce the pressure for immune evolution, but it would also create dependencies. The population would become reliant on the artificial maintenance of their microbial environment. If that maintenance failed, if dangerous pathogens found their way in despite all precautions, the consequences could be severe. The ideal solution might involve both robust immune systems and careful microbial management. But achieving this balance across thousands of years of evolution and social change would be extraordinarily difficult. Different populations might find different solutions, leading to further divergence between space-dwelling human varieties. Another biological system that deserves attention is the reproductive system. The perpetuation of the species across 20,000 years would require successful reproduction across 800 or more generations. Each link in this chain must hold, or the lineage ends. We know surprisingly little about human reproduction in space. No human has ever conceived in microgravity. No human pregnancy has occurred beyond Earth's surface. The effects of space on reproductive cells, on embryonic development, on fetal growth, on birth and early childhood, all of these remain largely unknown. What we do know is concerning. Animal studies suggest that microgravity affects early embryonic development. DNA damage from radiation could affect reproductive cells, potentially causing infertility or developmental abnormalities. The stress of space might disrupt hormonal cycles essential for reproduction. For space populations to be viable, these problems would need to be solved. either through technology that compensates for the difficulties or through evolution that adapts the reproductive system to the space environment. Technological solutions might include artificial gravity for pregnant women and young children, or genetic screening and selection to eliminate mutations that would cause developmental problems, or artificial womb technology that allows embryos to develop in carefully controlled conditions. Evolutionary solutions would involve the spread of genetic variants that support successful reproduction in space. This might mean more robust reproductive cells that resist radiation damage, or developmental pathways that function properly in microgravity, or hormonal systems less susceptible to disruption by the stresses of confinement and isolation. Over many generations, space populations would be shaped by differential reproductive success. Those who reproduce successfully would pass on their genes. Those who do not would leave no descendants. This is the basic mechanism of evolution, operating on the most fundamental of biological functions. The result might be humans with reproductive systems significantly different from our own. Systems optimized for space conditions that might not function properly under Earth gravity. The journey to the stars might be a one-way trip, not just geographically, but reproductively. Space-adapted humans might be unable to have children on Earth even if they could survive there physically. This brings us back to the question of speciation. Reproductive isolation is the key criterion for species distinction. If space-adapted humans cannot reproduce with Earth humans, they are by definition a different species. And this might happen not through dramatic genetic differences, but through subtle changes in reproductive compatibility. The speciation of humanity in space might not be a single event, but a gradual process. First, interbreeding becomes difficult. Then it becomes unlikely to produce viable offspring. Finally, it becomes impossible. The two populations would drift apart until they are as distinct as any two species that share a common ancestor. How long might this take? Estimates vary widely. Under intense selection in small populations, reproductive isolation could develop in as little as a few hundred generations. That would be only about 5,000 years at human generation times, well within our 20,000-year time frame. Alternatively, if populations are larger and selection is less intense, the process might take much longer, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. There is no certainty about the pace of speciation. But one thing is clear. If humans live in space long enough, under different enough conditions from Earth, speciation is likely. The tree of life that has produced millions of species on Earth would add new branches among the stars, and humanity as we know it would become just one twig on an ever-expanding tree. Consider what happens to spatial awareness in zero gravity. On Earth, we have a clear sense of up and down. Our inner ears contain tiny organs filled with fluid and tiny crystals that respond to gravity, telling us which way is vertical. Our brains integrate this information with visual cues to create our sense of orientation. In space, this system goes haywire. Astronauts often report feeling like they are perpetually falling, or perpetually hanging upside down, or both at once. Their brains receive conflicting signals that their Earth-evolved neural circuits cannot properly process. Over time, astronauts adapt. Their brains learn to rely more on visual cues and less on vestibular signals. But this adaptation is incomplete and impermanent. Over thousands of years, evolution would select for brains that are naturally better at processing three-dimensional spatial information without a gravitational reference frame. The vestibular system might shrink or be repurposed. The visual cortex might expand. The sense of up and down that is hardwired into human consciousness might fade away entirely. Try to imagine a human who has no concept of vertical, who moves through their world without any preference for one orientation over another, who can work comfortably while floating upside down relative to their colleagues because the very concept of upside down has lost all meaning. This is not just a change in behavior. It is a fundamental rewiring of consciousness itself. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound changes of all, the psychological evolution of humanity in space. Because evolution does not just shape bodies, it shapes minds. And the psychological pressures of deep space are unlike anything humans have ever faced. Imagine spending your entire life in a sealed container, never being more than a few hundred meters from every other person in your world, never experiencing true solitude, never experiencing true wilderness, never seeing a horizon that extends beyond the curved walls of your habitat for generations. The psychological toll of confinement and isolation is already well documented in studies of astronauts, Antarctic researchers, and submarine crews. Depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflict, cognitive decline. These problems emerge after just months of isolation. What happens after years, after lifetimes? Evolution would have to solve these problems, or humanity would tear itself apart. And the solutions might change our psychological nature in fundamental ways. Some scientists speculate that spacefaring humans would evolve a greater tolerance for monotony, a reduced need for novel stimulation, an enhanced ability to find contentment in routine and sameness. From our perspective, such beings might seem placid to the point of passivity, but from their perspective, they would simply be well adapted to their environment. Others suggest that social dynamics would be dramatically restructured. In a small, confined population, where everyone knows everyone else and conflicts can threaten the survival of the entire group, extreme social cohesion might be selected for. Humans might evolve to be more empathetic, more cooperative, less prone to aggression and competition, more like the tight-knit communities of our ancient ancestors, or perhaps more like the eusocial insects, with individuals subordinating their personal interest to the good of the colony. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can speculate about the humans of 20,000 years from now, we need to understand what kinds of environments they would actually live in, because the nature of the habitat shapes the nature of the evolution. There are essentially two scenarios for long-duration human existence in space. The first involves generation ships, massive vessels carrying thousands of people on journeys lasting centuries or millennia to distant star systems. The second involves permanent space habitats, artificial worlds, where humans live indefinitely without a destination, where the journey is the existence. Both scenarios present their own unique pressures, and both could produce radically different outcomes for human evolution. Let us begin with the generation ship. The concept was first seriously proposed by rocket pioneer Robert Goddard in 1918. He imagined a vessel carrying humans across the vast distances between stars. A journey so long that the original travelers would grow old and die. Their children would grow old and die. Many generations would live and die before the ship finally arrived at its destination, if it ever did. The basic math is sobering. The nearest star system to our own, Proxima Centauri, lies about 4 light-years away. With current propulsion technology, a journey there would take roughly 80,000 years. Even with highly advanced propulsion systems that do not yet exist, the journey would likely take many centuries at minimum, and many proposed destinations are much further away. A generation ship would need to be completely self-sufficient. It would need to produce its own food, recycle its own air and water, generate its own energy, repair its own systems, and maintain a stable human population indefinitely. The minimum population estimated to maintain genetic health over such a journey ranges from about 160 people to over 6,000, depending on various assumptions about social structure and genetic management. But maintaining genetic health is just the beginning of the challenges. What happens to human society when it is cut off from all contact with the rest of humanity for generations? When the home planet becomes first a dim point of light, then a fading memory, then a myth. Historical examples suggest troubling possibilities. Fiction and scientific analysis alike warn of societies that lose knowledge of their ship's true nature, of populations that descend into barbarism or religious fundamentalism, of cultures that fragment into warring factions, of technological knowledge gradually lost as the social structures needed to maintain it decay. Consider the phenomenon that science fiction writers have explored for decades: the generation ship as a world unto itself, where the inhabitants forget that they are on a ship at all, where the journey becomes the only reality, where the destination, if anyone still remembers it, becomes a religious promise rather than a practical goal. Robert Heinlein explored this in his story Orphans of the Sky. Brian Aldiss developed it further in Non-Stop. The crews of these fictional ships have descended into tribal societies. They fight over resources in the ship's corridors. They worship the ship's machinery as divine. They have lost all understanding of where they are and where they are going. Is this destiny inevitable? Not necessarily, but avoiding it would require deliberate planning and social engineering on a scale never before attempted. The cultures that board such a ship would need to be carefully designed to maintain knowledge across generations without Earth-based institutions to reinforce them. Some proposals suggest creating artificial intelligence systems that would serve as guardians of knowledge. Others propose rotating leadership structures that prevent any one group from monopolizing power. Still others suggest that periodic crises might be necessary to keep populations alert and engaged. Manufactured emergencies that prevent complacency. But whatever social structure emerges, it would be shaped by the unique environment of the ship. And it would, in turn, shape the evolution of the humans who live within it. Let us explore this in more detail. What kinds of social structures might develop in space habitats over thousands of years? And how might these structures influence evolution? On Earth, human societies have taken many forms: hunter-gatherer bands, agricultural villages, city-states, empires, nation-states. Each form arose in response to particular environmental and technological conditions, and each shaped the people who lived within it. In space, the environmental conditions would be radically different from anything humans have experienced. The technological requirements would be extreme, and the population sizes would be small. These factors would constrain the kinds of social structures that could emerge. Consider the question of specialization. In modern Earth societies, we have extreme division of labor. Most people know how to do one or a few jobs well. They depend on others for everything else. This works because our populations are large enough to support millions of different specializations. In a space habitat with a few thousand people, this kind of extreme specialization would be impossible. There would not be enough people to fill all the necessary roles. Each individual would need to have multiple competencies to be able to perform several different functions as circumstances require. This might lead to a kind of generalist culture. where breadth of skill is valued over depth, where everyone knows a little about everything, where the Renaissance ideal of the well-rounded person becomes a survival necessity rather than an elite aspiration. But there would also be critical specializations that cannot be distributed, the skills needed to maintain life support systems, to repair the hull, to manage the nuclear reactor that provides power, to perform surgery. These skills require years of training and cannot be expected of everyone. So space societies might develop a hybrid system. Most people would be generalists capable of contributing to many different tasks, but a small elite would be specialists in the critical systems that keep everyone alive. This elite would hold enormous power simply by virtue of their irreplaceable knowledge. How would such power be managed? On Earth, we have developed elaborate systems to prevent any group from accumulating too much power. Democracies, checks and balances, separation of powers. These systems work imperfectly because there are always alternatives. If one group becomes too oppressive, others can resist, can find different ways to meet their needs, can ultimately overthrow the oppressors. In a space habitat, there would be no alternatives. The life support engineers cannot be overthrown because without them, everyone dies. The power they hold would be absolute in a way that no Earth power has ever been. The question is whether social structures could emerge that prevent this power from being abused. One possibility is that the critical specializations would be distributed across family lines, with knowledge passed from parent to child, and with intermarriage between specialist families, creating a web of mutual dependence. No single family could dominate because each depends on the others. A kind of feudal arrangement where loyalty is to the system as a whole rather than to any individual leader. Another possibility is that the knowledge itself would be deliberately spread, stored in accessible forms, taught widely enough that no individual or group becomes irreplaceable. This would reduce the concentration of power, but might also reduce efficiency. There is a reason that modern societies specialize. It produces better outcomes in most circumstances. A third possibility is that artificial intelligence would take over the critical functions, removing the human element from the most dangerous concentrations of power. But this just shifts the power to whoever controls the AI, unless the AI itself becomes autonomous, which raises a whole different set of questions about the relationship between humans and machines. Whatever social structure emerges, it would shape the people who live within it. Humans adapt to their social environments just as they adapt to their physical environments. The psychological traits that help individuals thrive in a particular social system tend to become more common in the population over time. If the social system rewards cooperation, people become more cooperative. If it rewards competition, people become more competitive. If it rewards obedience, people become more obedient. If it rewards innovation, people become more innovative. The values and behaviors that succeed in a society tend to spread through both cultural transmission and, over longer time scales, genetic selection. Over 20,000 years, the social structures of space habitats would become deeply imprinted on the populations that inhabit them. The people and their society would co-evolve, each shaping the other in an endless dance of adaptation. Different habitats might develop very different social systems. One might become a rigid hierarchy where everyone knows their place. Another might develop a fluid meritocracy, where status constantly shifts based on achievement. A third might become an egalitarian commune, where all decisions are made collectively. Each system would produce different kinds of people, The hierarchical society would produce people comfortable with authority and deference. The meritocracy would produce people driven to achieve and compete. The commune would produce people who prioritize harmony and consensus. When these different populations eventually encounter each other, if they ever do, they might find themselves as different in psychology as they are in biology. The social evolution might be as profound as the genetic evolution, and just as likely to create barriers to mutual understanding. The population would be small by any planetary standard, perhaps a few thousand people at most, and it would be completely isolated from any other human gene pool for the entire journey. This creates the conditions for what geneticists call genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies that occur in small populations. On Earth, genetic drift is counteracted by gene flow between populations. Migration and interbreeding keep human populations genetically connected. On a generation ship, there would be no such connection. The ship's population would drift in its own genetic direction, accumulating unique variations that would make it increasingly distinct from any humans left behind on Earth. Add to this the increased mutation rate from cosmic radiation, and the ship's population would be a kind of evolutionary experiment, a petri dish where new genetic combinations could arise and spread through the population in ways that would take much longer in larger, more connected populations. After 20,000 years, the descendants of the ship's original crew might be genetically incompatible with Earth humans. Not because they had diverged so much in any single trait, but because thousands of small differences had accumulated, creating a new species that could no longer interbreed with its ancestors. This brings us to one of the most profound questions about long-duration space travel. Would the humans who arrive at their destination after 20,000 years still be human? By any definition we would recognize. The answer depends on how we define human. If we mean beings with our exact genome, the answer is almost certainly no. The genome of spacefaring humans would drift and mutate and be selected in directions we cannot fully predict. They would carry genes that we do not possess. They might lack genes that we consider fundamental to our nature. But if we mean beings who think and feel and hope and fear, beings who tell stories and love their children and wonder about their place in the universe, then perhaps the answer is different. These deeper aspects of humanity might prove more durable than our physical forms. Or they might not, because the psychological pressures of such a journey are just as intense as the physical ones, and the mind, like the body, evolves. Now let us consider the second scenario. Not a ship traveling to a destination, but a permanent habitat where humans live in space indefinitely. A world where there is no arrival, no goal except continued existence. No outside contact except for the fading signals from a distant Earth. This is perhaps an even more challenging scenario for the human psyche, because at least the generation ship has a purpose. A destination that gives meaning to the sacrifice and suffering of each generation. But a permanent space habitat, what purpose does it serve? What gives life meaning when the journey is eternal and the destination does not exist? This might seem like a philosophical question, but for evolution, it is a practical one, because purpose and meaning are not luxuries for humans. They are psychological necessities. Studies of isolated communities show that without a sense of purpose, humans become depressed, apathetic, and unproductive. Birth rates fall, suicides increase, societies collapse. So for a permanent space habitat to survive for 20,000 years, it would need to solve the problem of meaning. and whatever solution it found would shape the minds of its inhabitants for generations to come. One possibility is that religion would fill the void. Not necessarily the religions of Earth, which might seem increasingly irrelevant as centuries pass and the homeworld fades into myth, but new religions. Religions born in space, shaped by space, expressing the spiritual needs of people who have never known any other existence. These religions might venerate the ship itself, or the founders who built it, or the cosmos that surrounds it. They might develop elaborate rituals around the maintenance of life support systems, transforming the mundane work of keeping everyone alive into sacred duty. They might develop creation myths that explain their existence in terms that have nothing to do with Earth. From our perspective, such religions might seem strange or even disturbing, but they would serve a vital function, providing the psychological framework that allows humans to find meaning in an otherwise meaningless existence. And they would shape the evolution of belief, of social structure, and perhaps even of the brain itself. Another possibility is that technology would provide the meaning that religion once did. If artificial intelligence advances sufficiently, the inhabitants of space habitats might develop relationships with machine intelligences that serve many of the functions that deities once served, providing guidance, answering questions, offering comfort in times of distress. In such a scenario, the psychological evolution of humanity might move toward greater integration with artificial systems, not just as tools, but as companions, as advisors, as essential parts of the social fabric. The distinction between human and machine might become increasingly blurred. This brings us to one of the most provocative possibilities for human evolution in space: the merger of biological and technological systems. What some call transhumanism, what others call the birth of the cyborg. On Earth, we are already moving in this direction. Cochlear implants allow the deaf to hear. Pacemakers keep hearts beating. Deep brain stimulators treat Parkinson's disease. These are crude beginnings, but they point toward a future where the boundary between human and machine becomes increasingly permeable. In space, this trend might accelerate dramatically because the human body is poorly suited for space. But machines can be designed specifically for the space environment. So if humans could incorporate machine components into their bodies, they might be able to function far more effectively than purely biological beings. Imagine humans with built-in radiation protection, engineered organs that do not suffer in microgravity, neural interfaces that allow direct communication with ship systems, enhanced senses that can detect dangers invisible to biological eyes and ears. These would not be science fiction fantasies, but practical adaptations to an environment that punishes biological vulnerability. The children born on space habitats might receive their first technological enhancements before they can walk. Implants that monitor their health, interfaces that connect them to the habitat's information networks, modifications that help their bodies adapt to conditions that would harm unaugmented humans. Over generations, these enhancements might become more extensive and more integrated, until the distinction between the biological and the technological becomes meaningless, until the question of what is human and what is machine no longer has a clear answer. Some thinkers find this prospect frightening, a loss of humanity, a surrender to the machine. But others see it as simply the next step in human evolution, an evolution that has always involved tools. From the first stone axe to the smartphone in your pocket, humans have always extended their capabilities through technology. The only difference in space is that the technology would be inside the body rather than carried in the hand. And in an environment as hostile as space, such integration might not be optional. It might be necessary for survival. The purely biological humans might simply be unable to compete with their enhanced counterparts. Natural selection would favor the cyborgs, and over 20,000 years, the purely biological humans might disappear entirely. But let us pull back from these far future speculations and consider something more immediate. What happens in the first few generations, before evolution has had time to make dramatic changes, before the descendants of Earth have forgotten what the homeworld looks like? This transition period might be the most dangerous of all, because the humans who first leave Earth would carry bodies and minds shaped by millions of years of terrestrial evolution. They would suffer all the negative effects of space that we observe in astronauts today, and they would have to survive long enough and reproduce successfully enough for evolution to begin its work. Research on astronaut health provides sobering data. Beyond the well-known problems of bone loss and muscle atrophy, space produces effects that we are only beginning to understand. The immune system becomes dysregulated. T cells that normally protect against infection become less effective. Dormant viruses like herpes can reactivate. Even minor infections become more dangerous. The eyes undergo structural changes. The optic nerve swells. The back of the eye flattens. Some astronauts return with vision problems that never fully resolve. And these changes occur in relatively well-shielded environments in low Earth orbit. In deep space, where radiation levels are much higher, the effects could be far worse. Then there is the brain. Studies of astronauts show changes in brain structure after spaceflight. Some areas shrink while others expand. Cognitive function is affected. Reaction time slow. Memory becomes less reliable. Decision-making under stress becomes more difficult. In an environment where a single mistake can kill everyone, these changes are not merely concerning. They are potentially catastrophic, and we have barely begun to understand the effects of space on reproduction and development. Can humans conceive and bear children in microgravity? Early research suggests that it might be possible. Mice conceived in space have been born healthy after their mothers return to Earth. But we do not know if development in microgravity throughout pregnancy would produce viable offspring. And we certainly do not know if children who grow up entirely in microgravity can develop normally. The few studies that exist suggest reasons for concern. Embryos exposed to microgravity show changes in development. DNA damage increases. The cellular machinery that ensures proper development may not function correctly without gravity's organizing influence. Even if space-born children survive, they might face health problems we cannot predict. These immediate challenges create a selection bottleneck. Only those individuals who can survive and reproduce successfully in the harsh space environment will pass on their genes. And this bottleneck might be severe enough to dramatically reduce genetic diversity in spacefaring populations. Genetic diversity matters because it provides the raw material for adaptation. A population with limited genetic diversity has fewer options when facing new challenges. It may lack the genetic variations needed to adapt to changing conditions. It becomes more vulnerable to diseases that can spread through a genetically homogeneous population. Managing genetic diversity would be one of the critical challenges for any long-duration space mission. Some proposals suggest genetic screening before departure. Selecting for individuals with traits that confer advantages in space. Others suggest maintaining frozen genetic material that can be used to introduce diversity into the population over time. Still others propose genetic engineering to compensate for the losses. These approaches raise profound ethical questions. Who decides which traits are desirable? Who is included in the founding population and who is excluded? If genetic engineering becomes necessary for survival, what limits should be placed on modification? When does enhancement become something else entirely? When does a modified human stop being human? These questions do not have easy answers, and they would need to be grappled with long before any multi-generation space mission launches, because the decisions made at the beginning would shape everything that follows. Consider the ethical implications of selecting founders based on genetic traits. Such selection has disturbing historical precedents. Eugenics programs of the 20th century caused immense suffering and injustice. The idea of choosing who gets to reproduce based on their genetics evokes those horrors. Yet in the context of space colonization, some selection might be unavoidable. Space is merciless. It does not care about equality or justice. It simply kills those who cannot survive in it. Sending people into space who carry genetic variants that make them vulnerable to radiation or prone to bone loss might be sentencing them to suffering and early death. How do we balance these competing concerns? The need for genetic fitness against the commitment to equality. The imperatives of survival against the values of freedom and dignity. These are not merely theoretical questions. They are questions that any serious space colonization effort must answer. And the answers chosen would themselves shape the societies that emerge in space. A founding culture that embraces genetic selection might develop very different values than one that resists it. The decisions made by the first generation would echo through all the generations that follow. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of long-duration space travel. The people who make the initial decisions would not live to see their consequences. They would be setting in motion processes that would unfold over millennia, creating conditions that would shape beings they cannot imagine, choosing between futures they cannot foresee. It is rather like parents sending children into the world, except multiplied by thousands of generations, and playing out in an environment so different from Earth that even our best predictions might be wildly wrong. But let us assume that these challenges can be overcome, that the first generation survives and reproduces, that the population stabilizes and begins to grow, that life in space becomes, if not normal, at least sustainable. What then? Then evolution truly begins its work, and the changes that follow would transform humanity in ways we are only beginning to imagine. One of the most significant forces would be cosmic radiation. On Earth, we are protected from the worst of the cosmos by our planet's atmosphere and magnetic field. These shields absorb or deflect the high-energy particles that would otherwise constantly bombard us. In space, that protection largely disappears. Cosmic radiation consists primarily of protons and helium nuclei moving at nearly the speed of light. These particles have enough energy to pass right through spacecraft hulls. They strike the atoms of anything in their path, including human tissue. When they hit DNA, they can cause damage that the cell's repair mechanisms cannot easily fix. Broken strands, missing bases, mutations that accumulate with each passing day. Current spacecraft provide some shielding, but no practical amount of shielding can stop the most energetic cosmic rays. Some particles have so much energy that they would pass through a wall of lead several meters thick. The only complete protection would be massive amounts of mass between the travelers and the cosmos, more mass than any reasonable spacecraft could carry. So the inhabitants of long-duration space missions would be exposed to elevated radiation throughout their lives. Not enough to cause immediate radiation sickness, but enough to increase cancer risk, enough to cause genetic damage, enough over many generations to dramatically increase the rate of mutation. Most mutations are harmful. They disrupt the carefully tuned machinery of the cell. They cause disease or death. Natural selection eliminates these mutations from the population over time. But some small fraction of mutations are beneficial. Fashion. They confer advantages that help the individual survive and reproduce. These mutations spread through the population. On Earth, the mutation rate is low enough that evolution proceeds slowly. Beneficial mutations are rare. They take many generations to become common. But in space, with mutation rates perhaps 10 to 100 times higher, the raw material for evolution would be much more abundant. Scientists estimate that under these conditions, evolution could proceed 1,000 to 10,000 times faster than on Earth. Changes that would normally require millions of years might occur in tens of thousands. The 20,000-year timeline we are considering might see evolutionary changes comparable to what normally takes 200 million years or more. What kinds of changes might cosmic radiation favor? Most obviously, it would favor any genetic variations that confer radiation resistance. There is natural variation in radiation sensitivity among humans. Some people are genetically better at repairing DNA damage than others. Some have cellular machinery that is less affected by radiation exposure. These individuals would have a survival advantage in space. They would live longer, reproduce more, and pass on their radiation-resistant genes. Over many generations, the population would become increasingly radiation-resistant, not immune to radiation damage, but better able to tolerate it, better able to repair the constant assault on their genetic material. This might involve enhanced DNA repair enzymes, or changes to cell cycle checkpoints that detect and correct damage, or modifications to cellular mechanisms that currently make us vulnerable to radiation-induced cancer. The specific genetic changes cannot be predicted. Evolution is a process of trial and error, not design. Many different mutations might contribute to radiation resistance. The ones that actually spread through the population would depend on chance as much as on their benefits. But the end result would be humans, who are fundamentally different from us at the cellular level, whose DNA repair mechanisms are far more robust than ours, who can absorb radiation doses that would be deadly to Earth humans with relatively little harm. Beyond radiation resistance, evolution would favor any trait that helps survival in the space environment. Efficient metabolism, since resources would be limited. Tolerance for recycled air and water that might carry trace contaminants. Resistance to the psychological stresses of confinement. Ability to cooperate in small groups under pressure. Each of these pressures would shift the gene frequencies of the population in particular directions, and the shifts would compound over time. Generation after generation, the population would become better adapted to space and less adapted to Earth. This raises a profound question. If humans evolved to be well suited for space, would they still be able to live on Earth? The answer might be no. Consider what happens to astronauts who return to Earth after extended spaceflight. Their weakened bones and muscles struggle to support their weight. Their cardiovascular systems, adapted to microgravity, labor to pump blood against gravity. Many feel ill for weeks or months. Some never fully recover. Now imagine humans who have evolved for thousands of years in microgravity, whose bodies have been optimized for weightlessness across hundreds of generations, whose bones are lightweight and flexible, whose muscles are designed for floating rather than standing, whose hearts are sized for pumping blood in a body without a vertical axis. Such beings might find Earth crushing. The gravity that we barely notice would be an unbearable weight on their fragile frames. Their bones might fracture simply from trying to stand. Their hearts might fail from the unaccustomed strain. The planet that birthed their species would be as hostile to them as the vacuum of space is to us. This is the profound irony of space adaptation. To truly live in space, humans might have to give up the ability to live on Earth. The cradle of humanity would become as alien to its space-dwelling descendants as any distant planet. And this is where the story of human evolution in space becomes not just a scientific speculation, but a philosophical one. What does it mean to be human if you cannot survive on the world where humanity evolved? What is lost when the connection to our origins is not just forgotten, but severed at the biological level? Some would argue that nothing essential is lost, that humanity is defined not by our bodies, but by our minds. Our capacity for love and creativity and wonder, our ability to ask questions about our place in the universe. If these qualities persist in our space-adapted descendants, then they are still human in every way that matters. Others would argue that something profound is indeed lost, that our connection to Earth is part of what makes us who we are, that a being who cannot walk under a blue sky or swim in an ocean or feel rain on their face is no longer human in any meaningful sense, that such beings would be something new, something that deserves its own name. Perhaps both views are correct. Perhaps the space-adapted descendants of humanity would be both continuous with us and radically different from us. Like children who grow up to become adults we barely recognize, still our children, but also their own, independent beings. This brings us to the question of speciation, the formation of new species. At what point do accumulated differences become so great that two populations can no longer interbreed? At what point do the descendants of a common ancestor become, in biological terms, different species? The standard definition of species involves reproductive isolation. Two populations that cannot produce fertile offspring together are considered different species. By this definition, the question is whether space-adapted humans would still be able to interbreed with Earth humans after 20,000 years of separation and divergent evolution. The answer is uncertain, but there are reasons to think that reproductive isolation might develop relatively quickly under the extreme conditions of space evolution. First, the small population sizes on spacecraft or space habitats would lead to significant genetic drift. Random changes in gene frequencies would accumulate, making the space population increasingly distinct from any Earth population. Some of these changes might affect reproductive compatibility. Second, the intense selective pressures would favor different traits in space than on Earth. Adaptations that help survival in microgravity might interfere with reproduction with non-adapted individuals. The two populations would be evolving in different directions under different pressures. Third, any genetic engineering or technological modification would add another layer of difference. If space-dwelling humans incorporate cybernetic enhancements or undergo deliberate genetic modification, their biology would diverge from Earth humans even faster than natural evolution alone would predict. Scientists have speculated that complete reproductive isolation might develop in as little as a few hundred generations under intense selection. At roughly 25 years per generation, that would be only a few thousand years, well within our 20,000-year time frame. If this happened, it would mean that the descendants of spacefaring humans would no longer be Homo sapiens. They would be a new species. Perhaps something we might call Homo celestis, the heavenly human, or Homo stellaris, the human of the stars. Whatever we call them, they would represent a branching point in the tree of life, a new experiment in what intelligent, tool-using beings can become. And they might not be the only such species, because space is vast, and isolated populations evolve in different directions. Imagine multiple space habitats, each separated by vast distances, each maintaining its own small population, each facing its own unique environmental challenges, each cut off from gene flow with the others. Over 20,000 years, each of these populations would evolve along its own trajectory. They would adapt to their specific environments. They would experience different mutations, different selection pressures, different genetic drift. They would develop different cultures, different languages, different religions. When such populations eventually encountered each other, if they ever did, they might find themselves as alien to each other as either is to their Earth ancestors. Different species with different abilities and different needs, perhaps so different that communication itself would be difficult. This is the scenario that some speculative scientists find most fascinating. Not a single human species spreading across the galaxy, but a radiation of multiple species, all descended from Earth humans, each adapted to different cosmic niches. A Cambrian explosion of human evolution played out across the stars. Let us imagine what such an encounter might look like. A ship from one habitat approaches another after centuries of isolation. The inhabitants have heard legends of other vessels, other communities, other descendants of Earth, but they have never met them. Their histories have been separate for so long that the other has become mythological. The first challenge would be simple recognition. Would they even identify each other as related beings? If one population has evolved for high radiation environments while another has adapted to microgravity, their bodies might look nothing alike. One might be tall and spindly, the other compact and radiation hardened. One might have evolved enhanced visual processing, the other enhanced hearing. They might look at each other and see monsters. Communication would be the next barrier. Even if both populations retained the capacity for spoken language, their languages would have diverged beyond recognition. Finding common ground might require years of patient work, of building new shared vocabularies, of discovering what concepts they share and what concepts are unique to each culture. And even if communication is achieved, understanding might be elusive. Beings who have lived in utterly different environments for thousands of years would have utterly different assumptions about reality. What counts as normal? What counts as dangerous? What counts as beautiful or frightening or sacred? These fundamental categories might not translate. Some encounters might be friendly. Two populations recognizing kinship across the gulf of divergent evolution, sharing knowledge and resources, perhaps even attempting to reconnect gene pools, if such reconnection is still biologically possible. These reunions might spark golden ages of cultural exchange and hybrid vigor. Other encounters might be hostile. Resources in space are finite. Two populations might want the same asteroid, the same orbit, the same rare elements. Competition that on Earth led to war might lead to extinction in space, where there is no wilderness to flee to, no neutral territory to retreat into. Or encounters might be simply bewildering. Two populations that have become so different that neither can comprehend the other, who share physical space but cannot share meaning, who pass by each other like ships in the night, unable to connect across the chasm of 20,000 years of separate evolution. The politics of such a multi-species future would be unimaginably complex. alliances and rivalries between populations that barely understand each other, treaties written in languages that capture only the smallest fraction of what each party truly means, misunderstandings that escalate into conflicts, cooperative projects that fail because the cooperating parties have fundamentally incompatible assumptions. Some thinkers imagine that such complexity would lead to consolidation, that the populations that survive would be those that develop the capacity for flexibility in translation, that eventually, out of chaos, some new cosmic order would emerge, a way of coexisting that accommodates radical difference while maintaining enough common ground for peaceful interaction. Others imagine permanent fragmentation, that once populations diverge beyond a certain point, no force can bring them back together, that the galaxy would fill with countless separate civilizations, each pursuing its own path, each barely aware of the others, except as distant signals in the cosmic noise. The truth might be somewhere in between. Perhaps some populations would maintain contact while others would drift away. Perhaps local clusters of related species would form, like extended families on a cosmic scale, while more distant populations would become truly alien. Perhaps the tree of posthuman life would have many branches, some intertwined and some forever separate. This multiplicity adds another dimension to our earlier questions about identity and humanity. In a cosmos filled with diverse descendants of Earth humans, who gets to decide what counts as human? Would there be authorities who define the boundaries of the family? Would some species be excluded? On what basis? These questions might seem abstract, but they would have practical consequences. Resources might be shared with family, but not with strangers. Populations might accept refugees from related groups, but not from others. The definition of humanity might determine who lives and who dies in moments of crisis. Some populations might embrace an expansive definition. All beings descended from Earth, humans are human, regardless of how they have changed. Others might draw the line more narrowly. Only beings who share certain biological features, or only beings who maintain certain cultural practices, or only beings who accept certain political or religious authority. The diversity of answers might itself become a source of conflict. Populations that believe in cosmic human unity might clash with populations that believe in separate destinies. Universalists might condemn exclusivists as traitors to the human heritage. Exclusivists might condemn universalists as dangerously naive about the real differences that separate species. These debates would echo the debates about human identity that have played out on Earth across our history. Who counts as civilized? Who counts as fully human? Who deserves rights and recognition? The answers we have given on Earth have been tragically imperfect. There is no reason to assume that our cosmic descendants would do better. In such a scenario, the question of what counts as human becomes even more fraught. Would all of these species be considered part of a broader human family? Or would some diverge so far that they could no longer be considered human at all? The answer might depend on more than biology. It might depend on whether they maintain any cultural connection to their shared origins, whether they remember Earth, whether they tell stories about the ancestors who first ventured into space, whether they feel any kinship with other beings who share that history. Culture can persist even when biology diverges. Different human populations on Earth have developed remarkably different physical characteristics over tens of thousands of years. Yet they still recognize each other as human because they share fundamental cultural capacities. Language, tool use, art, religion. These cultural universals transcend biological differences. Perhaps the same would be true among space-adapted humans. Perhaps cultural continuity would provide the common thread that links species who can no longer interbreed. Perhaps stories and values and the shared memory of Earth would define humanity in an age when biology no longer can. But here we encounter another complication, because culture itself would evolve, and it might evolve even faster than biology. Consider what happens to language in isolated populations. On Earth, we have seen languages diverge dramatically over relatively short periods. English speakers today cannot read Old English without specialized training. 1,000 years was enough to transform the language almost beyond recognition. In space, linguistic drift would be even more pronounced. With no contact with Earth languages, no written records that remain comprehensible across generations, no external influences to slow the pace of change, the languages spoken on space habitats would evolve rapidly. After a few centuries, the descendants of English speakers might speak something completely unintelligible to their Earth counterparts. After a few millennia, the connection to any Earth language might be virtually undetectable. New vocabularies would emerge for the realities of space life. New grammatical structures might develop to express concepts that have no equivalent on Earth. The very sounds of the language might shift as vocal apparatus evolved for different atmospheric pressures or compositions. And if there are multiple isolated space populations, each would develop its own linguistic trajectory. The diversity of human language that took tens of thousands of years to develop on Earth might emerge again among space populations in just a few thousand. This linguistic divergence would reinforce biological divergence. When populations cannot communicate, they cannot exchange ideas. They cannot learn from each other. They cannot maintain the cultural connections that might otherwise bridge biological differences. Language barriers would accelerate the fragmentation of humanity into distinct species and civilizations. Beyond language, consider what would happen to other aspects of culture. Art, music, stories, values, all of these would be shaped by the unique environment of space. What kind of art emerges in a world without nature, where there are no sunsets to paint, no forest to describe, no oceans to inspire? The art of space-dwelling humans would have to find new subjects. The vast blackness between stars, the intricate machinery that keeps everyone alive, the small community that constitutes the entire social world, the memories and myths of an Earth that most have never seen. Some of this art might be recognizable to us: portraits of loved ones, abstract expressions of emotion, representations of dreams and fears, but other art might be utterly alien, expressing experiences and perceptions that we cannot even imagine. Art created by beings whose senses have adapted to different wavelengths of light, whose aesthetic preferences have been shaped by environments without horizons or weather or natural forms. Music, too, would evolve in unexpected directions. The rhythms that humans find pleasing are partly innate and partly culturally learned. In a world without day and night, without seasons, without the heartbeat rhythm of gravity, what rhythms would emerge? What kinds of sounds would space-adapted humans find beautiful? Perhaps they would create music that incorporates the sounds of their environment. The hum of life support systems, the vibrations of the spinning habitat, the radio frequencies that carry messages between distant stations, music that would sound like noise to us, but that expresses the sonic world of beings who have never heard birdsong or thunder, or the crash of waves. Values too would shift. What is considered good and right and proper is shaped by the environment in which a society exists. The values that helped humans survive on Earth might not serve as well in space. New values might emerge to address new challenges. Consider privacy. On Earth, we place great value on personal space and privacy. We have evolved in environments where isolation was possible and sometimes necessary. Our psychologies require periods of solitude. Our societies have developed elaborate norms around personal boundaries. In a space habitat where every resource is precious and every square meter of living space represents enormous investment, such values might become impractical. Privacy might come to be seen as a luxury that the community cannot afford. New norms might emerge around shared space and collective living that would feel oppressive to us, but would seem natural to those raised with them. Or consider the value placed on individual achievement. Western cultures especially emphasize personal success and competition. We admire those who rise above the crowd, who accomplish great things through their own efforts. This value system makes sense in societies large enough that individual variation matters, where personal success can occur without threatening the group. In a small space habitat, extreme individualism might be seen as dangerous. Success that comes at others' expense could be viewed as threatening to the community. The values that emerge might emphasize cooperation over competition, contribution to the group over personal advancement, humility over ambition. Such values might seem strange to us. They might even seem like a loss of something precious about human nature, but they would be adaptations to an environment that demands them, and they would shape the societies and the minds of space-dwelling humans for generations to come. Let us pause here and consider some of the stranger possibilities that evolution might produce. Because when we think about adaptation over 20,000 years, we must remember that evolution does not follow human preferences. It follows survival. And survival in space might demand changes that we would find disturbing, even horrifying, from our current perspective. Consider the possibility of hibernation. On Earth, some mammals can dramatically slow their metabolism during winter months. Bears, ground squirrels, and hedgehogs enter states of reduced consciousness where their bodies require minimal resources. This ability exists in some form in our own genetic heritage. We are not so far from creatures who could hibernate. In space, hibernation would be tremendously advantageous. Long voyages between stars could be survived not through countless waking generations, but through sustained sleep. Habitats could reduce life support demands by keeping most of the population in hibernation, while a skeleton crew maintains essential systems. Crises that threaten resources could be weathered by putting non-essential personnel into suspended animation. If hibernation capability were selected for across hundreds of generations, humans might eventually develop the ability to voluntarily enter hibernation states, to slow their hearts to a few beats per minute, to drop their body temperature close to freezing, to survive for months or years in a state somewhere between sleep and death. Such beings would experience time differently than we do. A journey of decades might pass for them in what feels like a single long night. They might live lives punctuated by long pauses, waking occasionally to check on the state of their world before returning to dormancy. Their concept of aging and lifespan would be fundamentally different from ours. Or consider another strange possibility: the evolution of symbiosis with the microorganisms that share the habitat. We already know that the human body depends on trillions of bacteria and other microbes for digestion, immunity, and other functions. In a closed space environment, this relationship would become even more crucial. The microbiome of space habitats would evolve alongside their human hosts, bacteria that help filter toxins from recycled air, algae that live in human tissues and produce oxygen directly, fungi that break down waste products into usable nutrients. The boundary between human and environment might become blurred. After many generations, space-adapted humans might incorporate beneficial microorganisms into their bodies in ways that go far beyond current symbiosis. They might have photosynthetic skin that helps produce energy. They might have specialized internal organs that house colonies of organisms performing essential metabolic functions. They might be less like individual organisms and more like walking ecosystems. Such beings would be chimeras in the truest sense, collectives of different life forms working together so seamlessly that the question of where the human ends and the symbiont begins would have no clear answer. Their identity would be not singular, but plural, a community of organisms sharing a single awareness. Another possibility involves the adaptation of human consciousness itself. We take for granted that consciousness is individual, that each person has their own separate mind, their own private thoughts, their own unique perspective. But this might not be the only possible arrangement. In small communities where cooperation is essential for survival, there might be selection pressure toward more connected forms of consciousness, toward empathic abilities that allow direct sharing of emotional states, toward communication that goes beyond words to something more immediate and direct, toward a collective awareness that transcends individual boundaries. We see hints of this in human evolution already. Mirror neurons that fire both when we perform an action and when we see others perform it. The contagion of emotions in crowds. The way that close couples can sometimes finish each other's sentences or sense each other's moods from across the room. These capacities could be enhanced and extended. After 20,000 years of evolution in close-knit groups, space-adapted humans might develop forms of communication that we would call telepathic. Not in the supernatural sense, but through biological mechanisms that allow direct nervous system to nervous system connection. They might think together in ways that individual human minds cannot. Such collective consciousness would have advantages for survival, faster coordination during emergencies, better distribution of knowledge across the group, reduced conflict as individuals literally feel the impact of their actions on others. But it would also represent a fundamental change in what it means to be a person. Privacy of thought might become as foreign as privacy of space. There are even stranger possibilities still. Evolution is creative in ways we cannot anticipate. The cosmic environment might produce adaptations that we have not imagined because they solve problems we have not yet encountered. Perhaps humans might evolve the ability to sense electromagnetic fields directly, to perceive the magnetic field of their habitat or the radio emissions of distant stars. Perhaps they might develop sensitivity to radiation that allows them to avoid dangerous areas before instruments can detect the threat. Perhaps they might evolve new senses entirely, perceiving aspects of reality that are invisible to us. Or perhaps evolution might take darker paths. The ability to digest a wider range of organic materials, including things we would rather not contemplate. The capacity to survive on less oxygen, with corresponding changes in metabolism that slow thought and reduce activity. The development of social structures based not on cooperation but on dominance and submission. If such structures prove more stable in confined environments, we should not assume that evolution would produce beings we would admire. Evolution produces beings that survive. Whether we would want to be them, whether we would even recognize them as kin, is a separate question entirely. These speculations might seem like science fiction. And in a sense, they are. We cannot know which possibilities will be realized, and which will remain fantasy. But they are grounded in the logic of evolution and the demands of the space environment. They represent the range of what might emerge when human biology meets cosmic pressure. Perhaps the strangest possibility of all is that different populations would evolve in different directions, that the descendants of humanity would not be a single species, but a menagerie of different forms. Hibernating travelers and collective minds and symbiotic chimeras, all descended from the same Earth ancestors, all recognizable as having once been human, but no longer similar to each other. This brings us to questions of identity that are even more complex than we have already considered. In such a diverse posthuman ecosystem, what would unite these different forms? What would make them all part of the human story? Would they see themselves as related? Would they care? The answers might vary. Some lineages might maintain strong connections to their shared history. Others might forget or actively reject their origins. Some might feel kinship with all beings descended from Earth. Others might consider only their own immediate group as true people. This is perhaps the deepest uncertainty about humanity's far future in space. Not what bodies we would have or what technologies we would use, but whether there would be a we at all, whether the word humanity would still refer to something meaningful, or whether it would become an artifact of a past that most descendants have forgotten. With these possibilities in mind, let us now turn to a more concrete question. What would daily life actually look like for humans living in space for 20,000 years? What kinds of environments would they inhabit? What would it feel like to be one of them? The most commonly proposed design for long-duration space habitation is the rotating habitat, a cylinder or ring that spins fast enough to create artificial gravity on its interior surface through centrifugal force. The physics is well understood. If you have ever ridden a carnival ride where you are pressed against the wall as it spins, you have experienced the same effect. The most famous design is the O'Neill cylinder, proposed by physicist Gerard O'Neill in the 1970s. His original concept called for two counter-rotating cylinders, each about 8 kilometers in diameter and 32 kilometers long. The rotation would produce Earth-like gravity on the interior surface. The cylinders would be pointed toward the sun, with mirrors directing sunlight inside to support agriculture and provide a day-night cycle. Standing on the interior of such a habitat, you would see something no human has ever seen. The ground would curve upward in front of you and behind you, rising to meet the sky directly overhead. Where we see sky, you would see land, rivers and forests and buildings curving up and over to form a cylindrical horizon. The sun would be a bright spot moving along the central axis. The night would come when mirrors close to block its light. The psychology of such an environment is difficult to imagine. On Earth, the horizon tells us that the world extends beyond what we can see. In an O'Neill cylinder, you can see your entire world at a glance. The far end of your universe is visible just by looking up. There is nowhere that is truly distant, nowhere that is truly unknown. For some, this might be comforting. A world that is completely comprehensible, completely within reach, no wilderness to get lost in, no vast distances to fear. But for others, it might be stifling. A world with no beyond, no frontier, no place where adventure might lurk. The inhabitants of such worlds would develop their own spatial intuitions. They would learn to navigate by looking up rather than ahead. They would understand that walking in one direction for long enough would eventually bring you back to where you started. Their mental maps would be circular rather than flat. Children born in such environments would find them completely natural. they would not experience the existential vertigo that an Earth human might feel upon first seeing a curved horizon that rises rather than falls away. To them, the straight horizons of planetary surfaces would be the strange thing. The idea that you could walk forever and never return would seem bizarre. But O'Neill cylinders are just one possibility. Other designs have been proposed. The Stanford torus is a wheel-shaped habitat about 2 kilometers in diameter. The McKendree cylinder, proposed by engineer Tom McKendree, would use carbon nanotubes to build a habitat nearly 500 kilometers in radius and 5,000 kilometers long, a world almost as large as a small planet. In such a massive habitat, the psychological effects would be very different. The horizon would seem almost normal. The curvature of the world would be imperceptible in daily life. You might walk for days and never be reminded that you live inside a spinning cylinder rather than on a planetary surface. But even the largest rotating habitat would be finite. Eventually, you would reach the end wall. The psychological barrier that tells you this is not a real world. This is a container, a vessel, a machine designed to keep you alive in an environment that wants you dead. How would inhabitants process this knowledge? Some might embrace it, finding meaning in their role as caretakers of a great machine. Others might develop psychological defenses against it, myths and stories that obscure the artificial nature of their world, a kind of willful forgetting that allows them to feel at home. Over generations, such defenses might become cultural norms. The taboo against looking at the end walls, the stories that explain them as something other than what they are, the rituals that help people avoid thinking about the true nature of their existence. This might seem like denial, and in a sense it is, but it might also be adaptive. If knowing the true nature of your world causes psychological distress that reduces functioning and reproduction, then the individuals who develop effective denial mechanisms would have an advantage. Natural selection would favor the capacity for comfortable delusion. What a strange thought. That evolution in space might favor the ability to not see reality clearly. That the successful colonizers of the cosmos might be those who can believe the most beautiful lies about where and what they are. But perhaps this is not so different from human psychology on Earth. We too engage in comfortable delusions. We too construct narratives that help us feel at home in a universe that is vast and indifferent and ultimately hostile to all life. The difference in space would be merely one of degree. Let us now consider another aspect of life in long-duration space habitats: the relationship between humans and the technology that keeps them alive. On Earth, we often forget how dependent we are on technology. The food we eat was grown using machines and transported by vehicles and preserved by refrigeration. The water we drink was purified by treatment plants and delivered by pipes. The air we breathe, at least in cities, is filtered and conditioned and monitored. But we can still survive, at least briefly, without any of this. We can drink from streams. We can forage for food. We can breathe the open air. In space, there is no such fallback. Every breath you take was produced by machines that extract oxygen from recycled materials. Every sip of water was purified from waste by complex filtration systems. Every calorie you consume was grown in controlled environments using artificial light and recycled nutrients. There is no wilderness to escape to. No natural system to fall back on. The technology is not a convenience. It is the only thing between you and instant death. This total dependence would create a relationship with technology very different from our own. The machines would not be tools. They would be extensions of the self. They would be as essential as one's own lungs and heart. caring for them would not be a job, but a sacred duty. Cultures would likely develop around the maintenance of critical systems. Specialization would become not just an economic convenience, but a survival necessity. Some individuals would become responsible for atmospheric systems, others for water recycling, others for food production, others for the structural integrity of the habitat itself. These specializations might become more than occupations. They might become identities. Families might pass down responsibility for specific systems across generations. Pride in one's maintenance role might become a core value. The engineer who keeps the air flowing might be as revered as warriors once were on Earth, perhaps more. And what happens when systems fail? Because they will fail. In any sufficiently long time frame, every machine eventually breaks down. Every system eventually encounters a problem that its designers did not anticipate. In a space habitat, such failures could be catastrophic. The survivors of such failures, if there are survivors, would carry the memory forward. They would pass down the lessons learned. They would develop new procedures, new safeguards, new ways of protecting against similar failures in the future. Each crisis would become part of the cultural heritage. Each disaster would become a teaching story. Over 20,000 years, the accumulation of such crises would create a deep cultural memory of fragility, of vulnerability, of dependence. The inhabitants would know, perhaps better than any humans have ever known, how close they always are to extinction, how thin the margin is between survival and death. This awareness might shape their psychology in profound ways. It might create cultures of caution, of conservatism, of unwillingness to take risks. Why innovate when innovation might introduce unknown dangers? Why change when change might upset the delicate balance that keeps everyone alive? Such attitudes might seem stifling to us, but they might be necessary for survival across millennial timescales. The bold risk-takers might not survive long enough to pass on their genes. The cautious conservators might be the only ones whose descendants still exist after 20,000 years. But if this is true, then something important about human nature might be lost. Our species has always been characterized by curiosity, by the drive to explore and discover and try new things, by willingness to take risks in pursuit of knowledge and opportunity. If space selects against these traits, what becomes of the explorers who went to space in the first place? Perhaps the answer is different depending on the population. Some habitats might develop conservative cultures that last for millennia, but that never progress beyond a certain point. Others might maintain the exploratory spirit, but suffer higher mortality and more frequent near-extinction events. Over very long time scales, the exploratory cultures might be the ones that ultimately succeed, not because they have higher survival rates in the short term, but because they are the ones capable of adapting to truly novel challenges. The cautious cultures might survive routine difficulties, but be wiped out by unprecedented crises that their rigid approaches cannot handle. This tension between caution and exploration would play out differently in different populations, and the outcome would shape not just the survival, but the character of spacefaring humanity. Let us take a moment to imagine what a typical day might look like for someone living in a space habitat many generations after the founding. What rhythms would structure their existence? What routines would give shape to their lives? The day would begin not with sunrise, but with the gradual brightening of artificial lights. The habitat systems would simulate a dawn, increasing illumination over perhaps an hour to ease the transition from sleep. The person waking might spend a moment oriented by the familiar hum of atmospheric recyclers, the gentle vibration of the rotating structure beneath them. Morning routines would include rituals we might not recognize. A check of personal health monitors to ensure that the slow degradation of the body in artificial environments is proceeding within acceptable parameters. Perhaps a session in a centrifuge room that provides higher gravity to stress bones and muscles, preventing the atrophy that threatens everyone. Consumption of carefully calibrated nutrition, designed to provide exactly what the body needs with minimal waste. Work would fill much of the day, but not work as we understand it. In a habitat where survival depends on the collective, the concept of optional employment might not exist. Everyone would have duties. Everyone would contribute. The child of the atmospheric engineer would learn atmospheric engineering, not as a career choice, but as a heritage. The son of the food production specialist would learn to tend the hydroponic gardens. Leisure time would exist, but it would look different. Entertainment in such a world might focus on simulation. Virtual environments that recreate the sensory experiences of Earth. Programs that let inhabitants walk through forests, swim in oceans, feel rain on their skin. For those born in space, these simulations might be understood as fiction. Imaginary worlds as fantastic as any fantasy novel. Social life would be intense. In a community where everyone knows everyone, where every face is familiar from birth to death, relationships would be complex and inescapable. Privacy as we understand it might not exist. Personal space might be measured in centimeters rather than meters. The ability to get along with others, to manage conflict constructively, to find peace in constant proximity, would be essential survival skills. Meals would be communal occasions, not just for efficiency, though there would be efficiency gains in centralized food preparation, but because in a world where isolation is impossible, shared meals would serve as the ritual that brings the community together. The breaking of recycled bread, the sharing of carefully rationed treats, the conversation that binds generations to each other. Evening would bring gradual dimming of lights and lowering of activity. Entertainment, education, the telling of stories. In a world without external reference points, stories would become crucially important. The history of the habitat, the founding myths, the cautionary tales of past crises, the legends of heroes who saved everyone by their quick thinking or sacrifice. Sleep would come in quarters that seem impossibly small by Earth standards. Perhaps a personal space no larger than a closet. But for someone who has never known anything larger, it would feel normal, even cozy. The small sounds of neighbors through thin walls would be comforting rather than intrusive. Evidence that the community persists through the night. This daily rhythm would repeat across years and decades and centuries, changing slowly as the habitat changes, as technology improves or degrades, as culture shifts, but maintaining the fundamental structure that keeps everyone alive, the artificial day, the essential work, the communal bonds, the stories that make it all meaningful. Let us consider more deeply what childhood would look like in such an environment, because the children born into space habitats would be the first true cosmic humans, the ones who have never known anything else, the ones for whom Earth is not a memory but a myth. A child in a space habitat would learn differently than children on Earth. Their education would be intensely practical. From the earliest age, they would learn the systems that keep everyone alive. They would understand why the air recyclers must be monitored, why water cannot be wasted, why every action has consequences for the whole community. Games and play would serve evolutionary purposes. Children might play at emergency response, at system repair, at the roles they will eventually fill as adults. The line between education and entertainment would blur or disappear entirely. Every activity would reinforce the skills and values needed for survival. Physical development would follow different trajectories. In rotating habitats with artificial gravity, children might develop relatively normally. But in lower gravity environments, their bodies would grow differently, taller perhaps, with longer limbs and less dense bones. Their hearts would develop for different demands. Their muscles would form different patterns. Psychological development too would follow unfamiliar paths. The concept of nature versus nurture takes on new meaning when nature itself is artificial. What does it do to a developing mind to grow up in a world where everything is designed? Where there is no wilderness, no weather, no animals that were not brought by humans. Children might develop different relationships with uncertainty and surprise. On Earth, the natural world constantly presents unexpected situations. Rain when you expected sun, an animal crossing your path, a flower blooming where none grew before. These small surprises teach children that the world is larger than human intention, that not everything can be controlled or predicted. In a space habitat, surprises are usually bad. They mean something has gone wrong. An unexpected sound might signal a system failure. An unusual smell might indicate a contamination. Children raised in such environments might develop hypervigilance, an acute awareness of anything that deviates from normal. This could be adaptive for survival, but it could also create populations prone to anxiety. Social development would be shaped by the impossibility of anonymity. On Earth, children eventually leave home. They move to new places. They reinvent themselves among strangers who did not know them as children. In a small space habitat, this escape is impossible. Everyone you will ever know already knows everything about you. Every embarrassment, every failure, every awkward phase. This could create pressure toward conformity, toward not standing out, toward being acceptable to everyone because you will never escape their judgment. But it could also create deep bonds of acceptance. Communities where everyone has seen everyone at their worst and loves them anyway. Where pretense becomes pointless because no one can maintain a false front for a lifetime among the same few hundred people. Education itself would face unique challenges. What do you teach children who will never see Earth? What knowledge from human history is relevant to their lives? The poetry of the seasons, the navigation by stars, the agriculture that depends on weather. So much of human culture assumes conditions that simply do not exist in space. Some knowledge would be preserved for its own sake, for the beauty of it, for the connection to human heritage. But much would inevitably be lost. Each generation would have less direct understanding of the world their ancestors came from. Each generation would be more adapted to their present reality, more focused on the knowledge they actually need. Mathematics would remain essential, physics, engineering, the sciences that keep habitats functioning. But literature might become increasingly incomprehensible. Stories about wandering alone through forests, about sailing across oceans, about looking up at clouds and wondering if it will rain. These experiences would become as alien as the experiences of aliens themselves. New literature would emerge. Stories about life in habitats, about the heroes who saved everyone during the great atmospheric failure, about the romances that bloomed in the hydroponic gardens, about the children who dreamed of other stars. This literature would capture the experiences of cosmic humanity in ways that Earth literature never could. Food represents another dimension of life, that would transform completely. On Earth, food is tied to geography and culture. Italian cuisine, Thai flavors, Mexican traditions. Each region developed food ways that reflected what grew there, what animals lived there, what techniques worked with local conditions. In space, food production would be purely technological. Hydroponic gardens growing under artificial light, proteins synthesized from basic molecules, carefully controlled growing conditions optimized for nutrition and yield, rather than taste or tradition. The food of space would be designed food, engineered for purpose rather than evolved through culture. The earliest generations might mourn this loss. They might try to recreate the flavors of Earth using available ingredients. Recipe books might become precious heirlooms. The knowledge of what authentic pizza tasted like might be passed down like sacred wisdom, but later generations would not know what they were missing. To them, the optimized nutrition of habitat cuisine would simply be what food is. The concept of seasonal variation in diet would make no sense. The idea of hunting or gathering would seem as foreign as writing on stone tablets. New food traditions would develop, particular preparations that become associated with holidays or celebrations, treats made from rationed ingredients that represent special occasions. The social rituals of eating would persist even as the food itself changed beyond recognition. Taste itself might evolve. If certain flavors are more available than others, preferences would shift. If bitter compounds are common in efficiently grown plants, humans might develop greater tolerance and even appreciation for bitterness. If certain nutrients are difficult to obtain, the body might develop stronger cravings for the foods that contain them. After many generations, the palate of space humans might be incompatible with Earth cuisine. Foods we consider delicious might taste wrong to them. Foods they relish might seem unpalatable to us. The simple act of sharing a meal, one of the oldest human bonds, might become impossible between space and Earth humans. Now, let us consider what happens not just in the first few thousand years, but across truly deep time. We have discussed 20,000 years, but space is patient, and evolution never stops. What happens after 100,000 years? After 1 million? After 10 million? 100,000 years would see humanity spread across multiple star systems. Each colony would be isolated by the vast distances between stars. Communication would be possible but slow. Light itself takes years to travel between neighboring stars, decades to travel between more distant ones, centuries to span a significant fraction of the galaxy. Each isolated population would follow its own evolutionary trajectory. The pressures on a cold planet around a red dwarf star would be very different from the pressures in an asteroid belt around a yellow sun. Natural selection would push each population in different directions. Genetic drift in small populations would add additional divergence. After 100,000 years, the descendants of humanity might include dozens or hundreds of distinct species. Some might still be recognizable as human-derived. Others might have diverged so far that their origins would be difficult to trace. They would share a common ancestor, but not a common present. Communication between these species might be difficult or impossible, not just because of distance, but because of divergent cognition. If thinking itself evolved differently in different environments, the very concepts used to construct language might become incompatible. Two species might have no way to make themselves understood to each other, even if they could exchange messages instantaneously. 1 million years extends beyond meaningful prediction. On Earth, 1 million years ago, our ancestors were Homo erectus, beings who used stone tools and controlled fire, but had not yet developed language or art as we understand them. The difference between us and them is the difference that 1 million years of evolution can make. In the high-pressure environment of space, with accelerated evolution, 1 million years might produce changes equivalent to tens of millions of years on Earth. The descendants of humanity might be as different from us as we are from the earliest mammals, or even more different. They might have abilities and limitations we cannot imagine. Senses we do not have, forms of consciousness we cannot comprehend. Some lineages might have abandoned biological form entirely, uploading consciousness into artificial substrates, becoming beings of pure information distributed across computer networks spanning star systems. Such beings would be immortal in a sense. Their patterns could persist indefinitely, as long as the hardware that runs them continues to function. Other lineages might have merged with the ecosystems they created, becoming vast symbiotic networks that span entire habitats or planets. Distributed minds thinking thoughts across millions of connected organisms, beings for whom the distinction between individual and collective has dissolved entirely. Still others might have specialized for particular niches in ways that sacrificed generality for perfection. Beings optimized for zero gravity, who can never survive on a planetary surface. Beings adapted to extreme radiation, who would die in what we consider safe conditions. Beings whose biology is so precisely tuned to their environment that any change would be fatal. 10 million years takes us to a timescale comparable to the rise and fall of entire groups of organisms on Earth. The dinosaurs dominated for over 100 million years before their extinction. In 10 million years, the descendants of humanity might have risen to similar dominance across cosmic environments. Or they might have gone extinct. Or they might have transformed into something so alien that the word descendant no longer applies. At this timescale, the number of species descended from human ancestors could be in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, filling ecological niches across countless star systems. Each species as different from the others as lions are from dolphins are from eagles, all sharing common ancestry but nothing else. Some of these species might develop intelligence. Not the intelligence we started with, but new forms arising independently. Convergent evolution might produce minds in lineages that had lost sapience earlier in their history. The galaxy might fill with intelligent beings, many of them descended from Earth humans, but most of them unaware of this shared origin. 100 million years is the timescale of continental drift on Earth, of mass extinctions and their recoveries, of the transformation of life itself. At this scale, prediction is meaningless. We can say only that change will continue, that evolution will not stop, that whatever exists 100 million years from now will bear no more resemblance to current humanity than current humanity bears to the single-celled organisms that were our ancestors. And yet something might persist, some spark that cannot be extinguished, some pattern that copies itself across the ages. These ye drive to survive, the capacity for consciousness, the tendency to ask questions about one's own existence. If these traits are robust, if they arise again and again through convergent evolution, then they might persist even when everything else has changed. Perhaps that is the true legacy of humanity. Not any particular species or culture or technology, but the introduction of mind into the cosmos, the seeding of a galaxy with beings who think and wonder and dream. Whatever forms those beings eventually take, they will carry forward something that began with us. Mental health in such an environment would face challenges we can barely imagine. The psychological toll of permanent confinement, of knowing that you will never see a natural landscape, never feel wind, never experience the randomness and surprise of an open world, of living your entire life among the same few hundred or thousand people. Depression would likely be common. The clinical kind that comes from lack of variety and stimulation. The existential kind that comes from confronting the artificial nature of your existence. The social kind that comes from inescapable relationships gone wrong. Anxiety too would be endemic. The awareness that every breath depends on machines, that a single system failure could kill everyone, that the margin between survival and catastrophe is measured in hours of backup power. Societies would develop to address these challenges, rotating duties to provide variety, careful management of social dynamics to prevent conflicts from festering, rituals and practices designed to promote psychological resilience, perhaps mandatory sessions with counselors or mind healers, perhaps pharmacological interventions as routine as vitamin supplements. And across generations, natural selection would favor those who cope best with these conditions, who find joy in small spaces and familiar faces, who do not suffer from the claustrophobia and depression that afflict others, who can maintain mental health in environments that would drive many of us mad. After hundreds of generations, the psychological profile of space-adapted humans might be profoundly different from our own. They might be constitutionally incapable of loneliness. They might find overstimulation in environments that we consider normal. They might feel genuine peace in circumstances that we would experience as oppressive. Whether this represents adaptation or loss is a matter of perspective. They would not suffer as we might suffer in their place, but they would also not experience the expansive joy that comes from standing alone on a mountaintop, from traveling to a strange land, from the thrill of exploration and discovery. Another crucial aspect of life across such timescales is the question of communication with the past and future. How would inhabitants maintain connection with generations they will never meet? How would they preserve knowledge across millennia? How would they think about their place in a story that began long before they were born and will continue long after they die? Time capsules and archives would become sacred objects. The original data cores containing information from Earth. The recordings of the founding generation explaining why they left and what they hoped to find. The accumulated wisdom of all the generations that came before. These would not be merely historical curiosities. They would be lifelines to identity, evidence that the community has a past and therefore might have a future. But information degrades over time. Storage media fail. Languages drift. Context is lost. The meaning of words changes until the messages of ancestors become cryptic or incomprehensible. Maintaining intelligible archives across 20,000 years would be a monumental challenge. Perhaps each generation would translate the archives into their contemporary language, adding their own commentary, their own context, their own interpretation. The original message becoming layered under centuries of interpretation, until what remains is less the voice of the ancestors than the ongoing conversation of the descendants. Or perhaps certain texts would be kept in their original form. Sacred scriptures that are memorized and recited, even when their meaning is no longer clear. The words of the founders becoming prayers. The technical manuals becoming holy books. Religion and history merging into something new. The relationship with the future would be equally complex. Would inhabitants leave messages for descendants they will never know? Would they plant trees whose fruit they will never taste? Would they make sacrifices for the benefit of generations not yet born? On Earth, such future-oriented thinking is often weak. we struggle to make sacrifices for people who will exist in 100 years. But in a space habitat, the connection between present actions and future consequences might be more visceral. The resource you waste today is the resource your grandchildren will not have. The system you fail to maintain will be the system that kills your descendants. This might foster a stronger sense of intergenerational responsibility, a willingness to sacrifice for the future that exceeds what most humans feel on Earth. Or it might foster resentment, a sense that you are sacrificing your one life for the benefit of people who will never know or thank you. Different cultures would resolve this differently. Some might develop strong traditions of intergenerational obligation. Others might become more present-focused, living for the moment in a universe where the moment is all you truly have. The tension between these approaches would shape the values and practices of each community. Now, let us turn to one of the most fascinating aspects of long-duration space existence, the potential for not just adaptation, but for enhancement, for transcending the limits of the human body and mind in ways that evolution alone cannot achieve. We have already discussed the possibility of cybernetic enhancement, of humans incorporating technological components into their bodies to better function in space. But there is another possibility that might prove even more transformative: direct genetic engineering. On Earth, we are at the very beginning of a genetic engineering revolution. Technologies like CRISPR allow us to edit genes with unprecedented precision. We can already modify the genomes of plants and animals. Human genetic modification is technically possible and has been done in limited ways, though ethical concerns currently restrict its application. In space, those ethical concerns might be outweighed by practical necessities. If natural evolution is not producing adaptations fast enough, if people are suffering and dying from the effects of microgravity and radiation and confinement, the pressure to intervene genetically would be enormous. Imagine being able to engineer humans who are naturally radiation resistant, whose DNA repair mechanisms are enhanced to handle the constant assault of cosmic rays, who do not suffer the bone loss and muscle wasting that plague current astronauts, who have immune systems that function properly in microgravity, who have psychological resiliences that protect against the stresses of confinement. Such engineering would not be cosmetic or optional. It would be survival. Parents would face the choice of conceiving children who would suffer the full effects of the space environment, or intervening to give their children the best chance of healthy lives. Some would object on principle. They would argue that such modification is playing God, that it is unnatural, that it opens the door to eugenics and discrimination. These objections deserve to be taken seriously. But in an environment where natural means suffering and early death, how long can such principles hold? Over time, genetic modification might become not just accepted, but expected, part of standard prenatal care. As routine as vaccinations are on Earth today, each generation would be engineered to be better adapted than the last. The slow randomness of natural evolution would be replaced by the directed intentionality of design. The implications are staggering. Humans would be taking control of their own evolutionary trajectory, deciding what traits to favor and what traits to eliminate, designing themselves according to their understanding of what is needed. Such control would introduce new dangers. What if they are wrong about what is needed? What if modifications that seem beneficial have unexpected consequences? What if the tools of modification are used not just for adaptation, but for enhancement beyond what anyone needs? What if some humans are modified for superiority, while others are left with natural limitations? These questions echo the concerns about eugenics that haunted the 20th century. But the context is different. This would not be about racial purity or social hierarchy. It would be about survival in an environment that is trying to kill you every second of every day. Perhaps the comparison to evolution is apt. Evolution is also ruthless. It also eliminates those who cannot survive. It also has no concern for fairness or equality. Directed genetic modification might be seen as simply taking conscious control of a process that has always operated unconsciously. But there is something unsettling about it nonetheless. Something lost when the lottery of birth is replaced by the intention of engineers. Some randomness. Some equality of opportunity. Some dignity that comes from being the result of natural processes, rather than designed products. These philosophical concerns might not stop genetic modification from happening. Survival usually trumps philosophy, but they would shape how people think about what they are becoming, whether they see themselves as still human, whether they feel pride or shame in their engineered nature, whether they honor or resent the ancestors who made them what they are. After 20,000 years of directed genetic modification, the descendants of Earth humans might be as different from us as we are from chimpanzees, or perhaps more different, because the changes would be intentional rather than random, selected for specific purposes rather than emerging from the blind process of survival and reproduction. Such beings might be perfectly adapted to their environment, healthy, long-lived, psychologically stable, cognitively capable, everything that space requires them to be. But would they be human? By what definition? And does it matter? These questions bring us back to where we began, to the fundamental mystery of what humanity would look like after 20,000 years in space. We have explored many possibilities: physical changes to adapt to microgravity, radiation resistance, psychological evolution, cultural transformation, linguistic drift, speciation, technological integration, genetic engineering. Each of these trajectories would carry humanity away from what we are today. But perhaps there is a thread that could connect the humans of that far future to us. A thread that is not biological or technological, but something more fundamental. The thread of consciousness, of awareness, of the experience of being. Whatever else changes, the beings who descend from us would still be conscious. They would still have inner lives. They would still experience joy and sorrow, hope and fear, love and loss. They would still wonder about their place in the universe. They would still ask the questions that humans have always asked. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? What does it all mean? These questions would be answered differently by beings shaped by 20 millennia of cosmic existence. Their myths would tell different origin stories. Their philosophies would grapple with different problems. Their religions would address different concerns. But the impulse behind the questions, the drive to understand and make meaning, that might persist. And perhaps that is what makes us human in the deepest sense. Not our particular bodies or genes or cultures, but the fact that we are the kind of beings who ask such questions, who care about the answers, who seek meaning in an indifferent universe. If that thread persists, then the beings who gaze at distant galaxies 20,000 years from now might still be recognizable as our children, different in almost every way, but still carrying the essential spark that makes us who we are. Or perhaps not. Perhaps even that spark can evolve away. Perhaps consciousness itself can take forms we cannot imagine. Perhaps the descendants of humanity would have inner lives so alien to our own that we would not recognize them as conscious beings at all. This is the deepest mystery, And it is one that we cannot answer from where we stand today. We can only speculate, only imagine, only wonder. But let us push our speculation even further. 20,000 years is the time frame we have been considering. But what about longer periods? What might happen if humanity survives in space for 100,000 years, for 1,000,000? For timescales that dwarf human history, the way human history dwarfs a single life. At 100,000 years, the divergence we have discussed would be profound. Multiple species descended from humans would likely exist, scattered across the solar system and perhaps beyond. Some might have reached nearby star systems, Proxima Centauri, Alpha Centauri, Barnard Star. The slow expansion outward would have begun. Each stellar system would become its own evolutionary experiment. Separated by light years of distance, these populations would evolve independently. Communication between them would be possible, but slow. A message sent to Proxima Centauri would take over 4 years to arrive. A conversation would take nearly a decade for a single exchange. Such distances would prevent any real cultural unity. The diversity of human descendants at 100,000 years might resemble the diversity of species within a biological family. Like the different species of cats, from lions to house cats, all recognizably related but each adapted to different niches. The Posthuman family might include beings adapted for different gravities, different radiation environments, different atmospheric compositions, all descended from us, but no longer similar to each other. At 1,000,000 years, the divergence would be greater still. 1,000,000 years is the timescale on which entirely new body plans evolve on Earth. The time between the earliest mammals and the emergence of recognizable modern forms. At this timescale, the descendants of humanity might be as different from us as we are from our earliest hominin ancestors. Perhaps more different. Some lineages might have merged with their technology so completely that the distinction between biological and artificial would have no meaning. Others might have rejected technology and evolved purely biological solutions to the challenges of space. Some might have developed forms of intelligence that transcend individual bodies. Others might have simplified, evolving away from intelligence as an adaptation that proved too costly in certain environments. The galaxy, at 1,000,000 years, might contain thousands or millions of distinct species, all tracing their ancestry back to Earth, but connected to each other only through that shared origin. They might spread through the Milky Way like dandelion seeds, each finding its own patch of cosmic soil, each growing in its own direction. At 10,000,000 years, we enter territory where prediction becomes almost meaningless. 10,000,000 years ago on Earth, the world was populated by creatures that look familiar in their broad outlines, but alien in their details. Mammals that we would recognize as mammals, but not as any species that exist today. The world changes completely across such timescales. The descendants of humanity at 10,000,000 years might fill ecological niches we cannot imagine. Some might be the dominant intelligence in their stellar systems. Others might have evolved into forms that we would not recognize as intelligent at all. Some might have achieved feats of engineering that reshape worlds or stars. Others might live simply, having lost or abandoned the technological civilization of their ancestors. And at 100,000,000 years, this is the timescale on which the dinosaurs ruled the Earth and then vanished. At 100,000,000 years, the universe itself will have changed. Stars will have been born and died. The galaxy will have rotated nearly half a turn. The cosmic environment will be different in ways we cannot predict. At such timescales, Asking what humanity will look like is almost like asking what life itself will look like. The answer is beyond the capacity of any mind, human or otherwise, to anticipate. Evolution is creative in ways that cannot be foreseen. The descendants of humanity at 100 million years might be as various and as strange as all the life forms that have existed on Earth since the first cells appeared in the primordial oceans. Perhaps this is the final answer to our question. Not what humanity would look like after 20,000 years in space, but what life descended from humanity might become across timescales that humble human imagination. Not one answer, but millions of answers. Not one future, but a forest of possibilities spreading out through time and space. We are at the trunk of that tree. All the branches that might grow from us are still potential, still unrealized, still dependent on the choices we make now and the choices our descendants will make in the generations to come. This perspective might seem overwhelming. The future so vast and various that our individual existence seems insignificant. But there is another way to see it. We are the beginning. We are the source. Everything that might come flows from what we are and what we do. The entire cosmic forest of posthuman life, in all its unimaginable diversity, starts with us. That gives our moment a unique importance. We are not just one generation among many. We are the generation that might begin it all, the generation that might send the first seeds into the void, the generation that might launch the process that leads to that unimaginable forest of life across the galaxy and beyond. Or we might be the generation that ends it, that fails to take the necessary steps, that allows the thread to be broken before it truly begins. The stakes could not be higher, which brings us back to the present moment, to the choices that lie before us, to the decisions that will shape everything that follows. If humanity is to survive for 20,000 years in space, the process must begin now, not in some distant future when we have solved all our problems, but now, with all our limitations and conflicts and uncertainties. The first generation ships and space habitats will be built by beings who are fully human in every sense we understand, who carry all the hopes and fears and flaws of our species, who will make decisions based on incomplete knowledge and competing values and the political realities of their time. Those decisions will echo through millennia. The founding cultures will shape everything that comes after. The genetic pool of the first settlers will be the raw material for all subsequent evolution. The technological choices made at the beginning will constrain what is possible later. This is a responsibility almost too heavy to bear. To be the ancestors of beings we cannot imagine, to set in motion processes whose outcomes we cannot foresee, to choose for all the generations that will follow. Perhaps that is why humanity has hesitated at the threshold of space, why we have sent robots and satellites, but have never truly committed to leaving Earth. We sense, perhaps unconsciously, the magnitude of what we would be undertaking, the irrevocability of the choice. But the choice may not be optional. Earth is finite, its resources are limited, its environment is fragile. In the long run, a species that remains on a single planet is a species with a certain expiration date, an asteroid, a supervolcano, a pandemic, climate catastrophe. There are too many ways for earthbound humanity to end. Space offers the possibility of insurance, of spreading the risk, of ensuring that even if Earth suffers catastrophe, the species will survive. This is perhaps the most compelling argument for space colonization. Not adventure or resources or curiosity, but simple survival. Not putting all our eggs in one basket. But there is another dimension to consider. What would happen to the relationship between Earth and its spacefaring descendants over the millennia? This relationship might prove as important as the physical and biological changes we have discussed. In the early centuries, the connection would likely remain strong. Space populations would depend on Earth for supplies, technology, and new settlers. Earth would depend on space populations for resources and as outlets for population pressure. Communication would be frequent. Cultural exchange would be active. The two branches of humanity would still feel like one family, but over time, the relationship would change. As space populations became self-sufficient, their dependence on Earth would fade. As they adapted to their environments, they would become different in ways that Earth dwellers might find disturbing. As distances increased, with populations moving to more distant habitats and other star systems, communication would become slower and less frequent. The psychological distance might grow even faster than the physical distance. Space dwellers might come to see Earth as the past, a place of nostalgia, but not of relevance. Earth dwellers might come to see space populations as strange offshoots, no longer quite human, no longer quite family. This estrangement might lead to conflict, competition for resources in the solar system, disputes over asteroid rights or orbital territories, ideological conflicts between populations with increasingly different values. The unity of humanity might fragment not through disaster, but through slow divergence, or the estrangement might be peaceful. Earth and its cosmic children might simply drift apart, like adult children who maintain polite contact with elderly parents, but no longer share their lives. The connection would persist in history and memory, but would fade as a living relationship. Earth itself might undergo its own changes: climate change, resource depletion, population shifts. The Earth of 20,000 years from now would not be the Earth we know. Its inhabitants might be as different from us as space dwellers are. The question of what is human might have no clear answer anywhere. And what of the Earth populations who never left? Who chose to remain on the planet of human origin through all the changes that time brings? Would they remain human in some pure sense while their cosmic cousins evolved away? Or would they change too, adapting to the altered Earth in their own directions? The irony is that there might be no baseline humanity, no unchanged template against which to measure the variations. Every population would evolve. Every culture would transform. The question would not be who remained human, but whether humanity itself would persist as a meaningful category across such spans of time. Some philosophers suggest that this is fine, that humanity is not a fixed essence, but a process, a river that flows through time, taking different shapes as it passes through different landscapes. What matters is not preserving any particular form, but maintaining the flow itself. The continuity of life and consciousness and culture, however much those things might change. Others argue that something would be lost if we cannot recognize our descendants, that there is value in preserving what we are, not just perpetuating something descended from what we are, that the transformations required for space survival might cost more than they gain. This debate would likely continue across the millennia. Each generation would face versions of the same questions. How much change is acceptable? What must be preserved? When does adaptation become extinction by another name? The answers would vary. The debate would never be fully resolved. If this argument is compelling, then the transformations we have discussed are not speculations to be avoided, but challenges to be embraced. If humanity must change to survive in space, then we must ask what changes are acceptable and what changes would cost too much. We must think carefully about what we want to preserve and what we are willing to sacrifice. These are not questions with easy answers. They involve trade-offs between competing values, between survival and identity, between adaptation and humanity, between the future we want and the future we can actually achieve. But they are questions we must begin to grapple with, because the decisions made in the coming century will determine whether humanity remains earthbound or becomes a cosmic species. And if we become a cosmic species, the decisions made at the beginning will shape what we become over the millennia that follow. This is perhaps the greatest adventure that lies before our species, not just the technical challenge of reaching other worlds, but the deeper challenge of choosing who we want our descendants to be, of consciously shaping our own evolutionary destiny, of becoming, for the first time, the authors of our own future. It is a responsibility that no species has ever faced before, and it is one that we cannot avoid, because even choosing to stay on Earth is a choice. It is choosing to limit ourselves, to accept eventual extinction, to close the door on possibilities we cannot imagine. The ancestors who first walked out of Africa did not know where they were going. They did not know what they would become. They simply followed the imperative to explore, to survive, to find new places to live and new ways to thrive. We are their descendants. We carry their genes. We inherit their drive. And now that drive points upward, toward the stars, toward a future that is as unknown to us as our world was to them. 20,000 years from now, beings will exist who are our descendants. Whether they live on Earth or in space, whether they are recognizably human or something new, whether they remember us or have forgotten everything about where they came from. They will exist because we exist today. They will be shaped by the choices we make now. What will those choices be? What kind of ancestors will we become? What legacy will we leave for the beings who will gaze at the stars long after we are dust? These are the questions that hang in the silence of space, waiting for answers that only we can provide. And so we return to where we began, to the child opening their eyes for the first time in a spinning cylinder between the stars, to the world that curves upward instead of away, to the hum of machines that keep everyone alive, to the stories of a blue planet that their great-grandparents, great-grandparents, great-grandparents once called home. That child will be the product of everything we have discussed, of evolution and engineering, of adaptation and intention, of choices made by ancestors they will never know. They will be human, or they will be something that was once human, or they will be something new that inherited the best of what we were. Whatever they are, they will look out at the stars. They will wonder what lies beyond. They will ask the questions that beings like us have always asked. And in asking, they will prove that something essential has survived, that the spark we carry has not been extinguished, that the 20,000-year journey through the void has not broken the thread that connects us across time. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps continuity of consciousness, of wonder, of the will to survive, and the drive to understand. Perhaps that is what makes any being the inheritor of human legacy. Not the shape of their bodies or the sequence of their genes, but the light that burns within them. The light that has burned in us since we first looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. That light will still be burning 20,000 years from now. It will burn in forms we cannot imagine, in beings we would not recognize, in worlds that are as strange to us as our world would be to the first humans who walked the earth. But it will burn, because that is what the light does. It persists, it adapts, it transforms, and it never goes out. This has been our journey through the possible futures of humanity in space. A journey through evolution and adaptation, through technology and biology, through psychology and culture, through the deepest questions of what it means to be human. We do not know which of these possibilities will come to pass. We cannot predict which pressures will prove most significant. We cannot foresee the choices that future generations will make. The future remains unwritten. It awaits the pen of time. But we can imagine, we can speculate, we can wonder, and in wondering, we participate in the great human project of reaching toward the unknown, of asking what if, of dreaming of what might be. Thank you for joining us on this voyage through time and space. If this journey of imagination moved you, please like this video and subscribe to continue exploring the wonders of the universe together. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think humanity would look like after 20,000 years among the stars? What traits would you hope our descendants preserve? What changes would you accept for the sake of survival? Until next time, keep looking up, keep wondering, keep dreaming of the cosmic future that awaits us all.